Hi, Mrs. Fernandy here, reading Chasing Vermeer by Blue Balliett. We have gotten to, chapter 18, A Bad Fall. Petra and Calder talked about the book on the way to school the next morning. All these questions being asked by people around the world, Petra said, still excited by what she'd read. It does make the theft seem partly good. Yeah, but what if the thief turns out not to be as moral as he sounds? What if he's a real sicko? Someone on the radio was talking about that this morning. Petra looked sideways at Calder. But don't you think I would sort of know if the lady had been hurt? They walked several steps in silence. Calder kicked at a snowbank. Maybe, and maybe not. I wish she'd say something else to you like, down this street, up those steps, in this cupboard, and presto. They were laughing when they turned the corner near Mrs. Sharp's house. To their horror, they found themselves facing the flashing lights of an ambulance. The children stood, mouths open, as a stretcher appeared at Mrs. Sharp's door. The old woman was neatly strapped in under a mound of blankets. She looked tiny and pale. Two policemen followed the emergency technicians. Mrs. Sharp, are you okay? Blurted Petra. Calder called out, what happened? At the sound of their voices, the old woman turned her head. Oh, good, it's you two. Close your mouths before your tongues freeze. Mrs. Sharp struggled to get her hand out from under the blankets. Stop, you carriers. I want to speak with these children. I know them. Mrs. Sharp's imperious tone brought everyone to a standstill. I slipped and cracked something in one leg. Very stupid of me, I must say. I never broken anything in my life. I was planning to take this letter to the post office today. I could have someone in the hospital mail it, but I would prefer giving it to the two of you. No problem. Calder reached for the letter in Mrs. Sharp's hand. She watched with something of her old fierceness while Calder put away the letter. Now, don't forget, and don't lose it, boy. Mrs. Sharp was eyeing the duct tape on Calder's backpack. The two of you can visit me at the hospital later if you'd like. I'm sure by then I'll be stuck in some dreadful room. Don't worry, Mrs. Sharp. We'll mail your letter. Want us to bring you books or anything? Petra asked. No. Oh, the pain of this darn leg. Stupid. Mrs. Sharp collapsed back on the stretcher. All set, ma'am? One of the EMTs asked her politely. Well, yes. Does it look like we're sunbathing on the Riviera here? Miss Sharp's voice trailed off into the freezing air as she was loaded into the ambulance. They watched it drive away. Poor thing. I guess we won't be having tea with her anytime soon, Petra said. I wonder who this letter is for. Calder reached into his backpack and pulled it out. It was addressed in neat handwriting to Miss Isabel Hussey. They held the letter up to a bright light in school. The envelope was impossible to see through. Giving it directly to Miss Hussey was tempting, but they had made a promise to Mrs. Sharp. It was hard to know who to be loyal to, or what the consequences of either decision might be. After school, they crunched through the snow to the post office on campus. Maybe we could steam it open, Calder suggested. Maybe she's just sympathizing. Maybe we're just suspicious, Petra said. Hey, what if we rip open the envelope and then put the letter in a fresh one? We'll just rewrite the address. In their excitement, they stopped and gave each other a high five. Petra suddenly looked unhappy. But aren't we getting pretty two-faced here? We go there for tea, we act like nice kids, and then we betray her. How would we like it if someone we trusted read our mail? This is probably how people turn into criminals. They just do something a little bit wrong and then something a little bit worse. It's not like we won't mail it afterward. We're keeping our promise. It's an emergency situation. Remember, we're on a mission to rescue Miss Hussey. The lady, Mrs. Sharp, and ourselves. We may be in danger too, now that we've got the third letter. So this is to protect everyone. Right. We're just doing a little much-needed detective work. They were now inside, standing next to one of the slits in the wall that read stamped mail. We could buy an envelope and readdress it here. Calder dug in his pockets for change. Petra still looked worried. What will Mrs. Sharp do to us if she finds out? And what if Miss Hussey recognizes our handwriting? This is foolproof. We're going to put the letter in the mail the minute we've read it. Mrs. Sharp will never know, and I'm sure Miss Hussey will throw away the envelope. Just then, someone jostled Calder's arm, and the letter fell. Calder reached for it, and his backpack swung off his shoulder, knocking both him and Petra sideways. The letter was now under a man's leather boot. Ah, so sorry. This is going in the mail too? The man then swooped the letter up in a large red paw and stuffed it into the slit along with his mail. I don't believe it, hissed Calder. Petra gave Calder a weak smile. I guess we've been saved from a lifetime of crime. When they arrived at the hospital, Mrs. Sharp was lying flat in bed. One leg was heavily bandaged. I can't give you tea, but you can have these. They're all I could get a hold of. Mrs. Sharp handed them each a large chocolate lollipop and pushed some buttons that made the head of her bed go up. I wanted to thank you for mailing my letter. The three of them sat for a moment in silence. I suppose you're wondering what the letter was about. Calder looked down at his lollipop. Petra swallowed hard. Mrs. Sharp's eyes narrowed. Children, was that letter mailed? There is something you're not telling me. Calder decided to come clean. Well, you see, we noticed the letter was to Miss Hussey, and she's our teacher, you know, and we've been following the thief's letters and advertisements in the Chicago Tribune, and we're working together on trying to find the lady. And Petra had a dream about the lady, and so we wanted to read the letter. We were just curious to see if you were worried about Miss Hussey too. Stop! Did you open my letter? Miss Hussey's voice was frightening. No, Petra whispered, it's my fault. It was my fault too. We thought that because you're smart and you like Vermeer, you might know something about the theft and that you might have some good ideas. We were curious about why you wrote to Miss Hussey. We were going to read your letter and then put it in a new envelope and mail it for you. But we didn't end up opening it. That's the truth. I'm really sorry, Mrs. Sharp. I don't know what got into us. Petra was almost in tears. There was a long, unbearable silence. Neither Calder nor Petra dared look up. Then a strange creaking sound came from the bed. Mrs. Sharp was laughing. It sounded as though she was a little out of practice. The children looked up at her in amazement. You're not angry? Calder asked. Oh, not really. Miss Sharp was drying her eyes with the tissue. I see myself in the two of you. I've done many things in my life out of curiosity and have regretted very few of them. The important thing here is that you stopped yourselves before you did something wrong. Her face straightened. Very wrong. The point is that you must never read someone else's correspondence. After allowing the children to feel uncomfortable for another few moments, she continued in a brusque tone. My maiden name, Coffin, is from Nantucket Island in Massachusetts. And when I read in the papers that Miss Hussey was from there, I just thought I'd share the coincidence with her. Now, what is this about a dream? Grateful that Mrs. Sharp didn't seem to be too furious about the letter, Petra started talking. She described in detail her dream about the painting, confiding that no one but Calder knew about it. She mentioned that Vermeer's lady sometimes seemed to communicate with her. Mrs. Sharp studied Petra intensely as she spoke. The old woman's eyes narrowed until they were almost slits in her face. Yes, she's speaking to you. Excuse me? Petra's voice was almost a whisper. Well, there are many things about life, many experiences that we don't have an explanation for, as Mr. Force said. But what interests me is the idea that much of what we humans take to be a lie is true, and much of what we think is true is a lie. Mrs. Sharp was speaking slowly, looking at her hands. Charles Fort would have said something to you like, who's to say that art isn't alive anyway? Who's to say what's real? If frogs can fall from the sky, why can't paintings communicate? Calder had hopped up from his chair. Petra, remember the Picasso quote that Miss Hussey told us about art being a lie that tells us the truth? Sit down, boy, you're making my leg nervous. Mrs. Sharp's frigid tone sent Calder back to his seat. Her face settled into an unreadable expression. Truth, perhaps. You think you two could succeed where the FBI has failed? Well, nothing happens in life unless you try, and we're pretty smart kids, you know. Calder had pulled out his pentominoes and was quietly making rectangles on the table next to Miss Sharp's bed. We haven't even told you about these. Smart, you think? Mrs. Sharp watched Calder for a moment in silence. What are those, boy? Some kind of new toy? They're pentominoes, Calder responded with dignity. He told Miss Sharp the name for each of the 12 pieces, then the letter name for each of the 12 pieces. Then he explained that you could make many, many rectangles out of them, but it took practice. Push that table over here. Miss Sharp tried putting the pieces together for a few minutes, mumbling 12 pieces, under her breath again and again. Everyone was quiet. No rectangles appeared. It's hard at first. It takes time, said Calder kindly. Bah! Mrs. Sharp was looking frustrated. I can think of something else you could do with these. How many, 5-letter words, say, could you make using at least 3 of these 12 letters in each word? Ever done that? No, both children were leaning toward the table now. Mrs. Sharp was saying, let's see, the letters are FILNPTUVW or MXY and Z. I love word challenges like these. Fines, flutes, lines, filmy, tails. Hey, that's 13 letters. Who said the W could be an M? Asked Calder. I did. Mrs. Sharp was busily pushing around the pieces. Wilts and tilts, added Petra. Melts, shouted Calder. Lower your voice, boy. We don't want one of those policemen outside the door to start bothering us. Now, if you could add another letter, you could have monkey, and then there's panel and vines. Mrs. Sharp was looking very pleased with herself, muttering, fines and fruit. At that moment, a nurse bustled into the room. Time for your medication, Mrs. Sharp. Oh, go away, she snapped. The nurse refused, and Calder and Petra stood up to go. As Calder picked up his pentominoes, Mrs. Sharp nodded at them. Wonderful tools, could be put to many uses. Yes, I even like to, began Calder eagerly. But Petra was pulling on his arm. We've got to go, Calder. Mrs. Sharp thanked them for visiting and waved one hand in dismissal. As they walked away, they could hear her arguing with the nurse. That night, Calder got a phone call from Tommy with the terrific news that he and his mom were moving back to Hyde Park. Tommy didn't know exactly when this would happen, but he said that the Dewey Avenue Rescue Fund, the money Calder and Petra had collected by selling brownies, was a definite help. Old Fred hadn't left much behind. Then Tommy told Calder more news. Frog had been found. His parents had gone on a long trip and left him in Washington, D.C. with a relative. No one in Tommy's New York neighborhood had been willing to tell the new kid, in Tommy's words, what was going on. Either that or they were all so unfriendly that they didn't know or care where Frog and his family were. Tommy said he'd just gotten a postcard from the National Gallery of Art, one of those Vermeer paintings, the stolen one, from Frog. Calder couldn't wait to tell Tommy what was going on, but knew he and Petra had to keep quiet for the moment. He called Petra immediately. She was thrilled to hear about Tommy. Calder went on, remember the N for National Gallery that day we were trying to get the pentominoes to say something about where Frog was? That day with the frog napkins and the rain? Uh-huh. Calder filled Petra in on the rest of the story. Makes me think of a Charles Fort thing. Frog disappears to the National Gallery, then a picture of the lady travels back to Tommy. It's not teleportation, but some kind of strange symmetry. Calder was quiet for a moment. Or some kind of weird joke, Petra finished. Things going together that don't seem like they should. Things with a scary sense of humor, added Calder.